It was a quiet afternoon in the affluent neighborhood of Atlanta. The sun cast a warm glow over the tree-lined streets, and Jasmine Carter, the newly appointed director of the FBI, stepped out of her home with a sense of pride. At 43, Jasmine had fought her way to the top, overcoming obstacles that often felt insurmountable. Now, as one of the highest-ranking officials in the country, she had the chance to live in a neighborhood she had once thought was out of her reach. Dressed casually in sweatpants and running shoes, she strolled down the sidewalk, savoring the calm morning air. The neighborhood around her was a symbol of wealth, with luxurious mansions and meticulously manicured lawns. Jasmine was proud of what she had accomplished, but she couldn't help but reflect on the years of hard work it had taken to get here. As she walked, she noticed the occasional passerby glancing her way, but she paid them no mind. This was her moment of peace. Jasmine had fought long and hard for this, and it was a rare occasion when she could simply enjoy the tranquility of her surroundings. But just as she crossed an intersection, she noticed something that immediately broke her peace. A middle-aged police officer, Officer James Harris, stood a few yards away, watching her closely. Harris had been working in this neighborhood for over 15 years, and he took pride in knowing who belonged in the area. He didn't recognize her, and something about the way she was dressed, casual, without the typical markers of wealth, raised suspicion in his mind. He decided to approach her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his tone firm but not unfriendly. "I need to ask you a few questions." Jasmine stopped and turned to face him, offering a calm smile. "Of course, officer. What's the issue?" "Where are you headed?" Harris asked, eyeing her more closely. "Do you live around here?" Jasmine nodded. "Yes, I just moved in. My house is on the corner." She pointed down the street to a large home that, in her view, reflected years of hard work and determination. Harris looked over toward the house, then back at her, still uncertain. "I've never seen you around here before," he said. "Do you have any identification to prove you live here?" Jasmine's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with situations like this before. "I didn't bring my ID with me," she replied, her voice steady. "But I assure you, I live here." Harris's gaze turned more scrutinizing. He had been in this neighborhood long enough to recognize most of its residents, and something about Jasmine didn't seem right. "You're telling me you live here, but I don't recognize you," he said, his voice tinged with doubt. "This neighborhood isn't a place for just anyone. Do you have any other form of proof?" Jasmine took a deep breath and stood a little straighter, sensing the tension in the air. "I'm just walking around my neighborhood, officer. I don't think there's a rule that says I can't do that just because of how I look." Harris stepped closer, clearly unconvinced. "You don't look like someone who belongs here." Jasmine felt the sting of his words. She knew what he meant. It wasn't her clothes he was questioning, it was her race. Despite the calm exterior she maintained, a flash of anger flickered within her, but she didn't let it show. "I have every right to be here," she said firmly. "I'm just walking around enjoying the neighborhood." The officer's suspicion deepened and his tone became more insistent. "Then why don't you just cooperate and show me your ID?" Jasmine's patience began to wear thin, but she held her ground. "I don't need to show you anything. If you have evidence that I'm breaking the law, you can present it. Otherwise, I think this conversation is over." Harris wasn't ready to back down. His pride was on the line. "If you're innocent, then why are you making this difficult?" he asked, his voice hardening. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Because I'm not going to stand here and let you treat me like I'm guilty for no reason." Officer Harris was silent for a moment, staring at Jasmine as if trying to decide his next move. He had never encountered someone who stood their ground like this before, especially not someone who didn't seem to fit his expectations. His suspicion began to turn into frustration. "You're not cooperating, and I don't like that," Harris said, his voice becoming sharper. "I've been patrolling this neighborhood for years. I know who lives here, and you don't look like you belong. I'm asking you one more time. Show me your ID." Jasmine felt her chest tighten with the weight of his words, but she refused to be intimidated. She had spent her entire life proving that she was capable and deserving of respect, and she wasn't about to let a police officer make assumptions based on her appearance. "I've already told you, I don't have it with me. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just out for a walk," she said, her tone calm but firm. Harris's face flushed with frustration. He took a step closer, now standing directly in front of her, his posture aggressive. "You don't get to tell me what to do. I'm the one in charge here," he snapped, his voice laced with authority. "If you don't show me your ID, I'll have to take further action." Jasmine felt a cold flash of anger, but she kept her composure. "You're overstepping your authority," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not going to tolerate this kind of treatment. If you don't have any reason to detain me, I'm leaving." The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Jasmine could feel the officer's frustration rising. It was clear to her that Harris's ego was bruised, and he wasn't about to back down now. "You're not going anywhere," Harris said, his voice harsh. "You're causing a disturbance, and I'm placing you under arrest for failure to cooperate." He reached for his handcuffs, but Jasmine quickly stepped back, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I told you, I'm not doing anything wrong," she repeated, her voice now more assertive. "If you want to arrest me, you're going to need a damn good reason. You don't get to make up the law as you go." Harris's eyes darkened with anger, and he pulled out his radio. "This is Officer Harris. I need backup at my location. Suspect refusing to cooperate. Possible resistance." His voice was cold and clipped as he spoke into the radio, but Jasmine could tell that his words were laced with his own frustration. As she stood there, her mind raced, but her body remained still. She had faced much more dangerous situations throughout her career, and she wasn't going to let a petty abuse of power intimidate her. Still, the threat of backup made her pulse race. She needed to de-escalate the situation before it went any further. "I'm warning you, officer," she said quietly, her voice cold. "You're making a huge mistake. I will not stand by while you abuse your power like this. You've already crossed a line, and if you continue, there will be consequences." Harris laughed, but the laugh was hollow, tinged with arrogance. "Consequences? You really think you can threaten me? I'm just doing my job," he sneered. Jasmine held his gaze without blinking. "You're not doing your job. You're abusing your position. And if you continue, you'll regret it." Suddenly, Harris took a step back and pulled his gun from its holster. Jasmine froze, her body tense as she stared down the barrel of the weapon. Her instincts screamed at her to stay calm, but the sight of the gun brought a rush of adrenaline. "Who do you think you are?" Harris shouted, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and authority. "Put your hands on your head now!" Jasmine took a deep breath, her heart pounding, but she kept her posture steady. "You are making a grave mistake," she said, her voice low and clear. "Put the gun down, and I will cooperate. But if you don't, I will not back down." Harris's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he hesitated, but then his resolve seemed to harden. He didn't lower the gun. "This is your last chance. Do as I say, or I'll make you." Jasmine stood tall, her eyes unflinching. She was fully aware that if she obeyed him now, the situation would only escalate. But if she resisted, she risked making things far worse. She weighed her options quickly, knowing that her next move could determine everything. "I'm not who you think I am," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. "I'm not someone you can push around. And if you continue this, you will regret it." The tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the radio crackling in Officer Harris's hand. His fingers tightened around the grip of his gun as he glared at Jasmine, whose composure never wavered. The atmosphere felt charged, like the calm before a storm, and every moment that passed seemed to fuel Harris's anger. "You're making a mistake," Jasmine repeated, her voice firm. "Put the gun down and let's resolve this without any further escalation." For a split second, it seemed like Harris was considering her words. The cold anger in his eyes softened ever so slightly, but it was quickly replaced by the arrogance of someone who had never been questioned in his authority. "I don't take orders from you," he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're going to regret this." Jasmine knew she couldn't back down. She had faced far worse in her career. High-stakes negotiations, dangerous criminals, and moments when her life had been on the line. But this was different. This was an officer of the law, someone sworn to protect and serve, abusing his power because of his own prejudice. She had to stand her ground. Before she could say anything more, Harris moved quickly. With a swift motion, he clicked his radio again, requesting backup in an agitated tone. "This is Officer Harris. I need backup here now. Suspect refusing to cooperate, possibly armed. Jasmine's heart pounded as she heard the words possibly armed. He had just escalated the situation, and now the stakes were even higher. It was clear to her now, he wasn't going to let her walk away peacefully. "I am warning you one last time, officer," Jasmine said, keeping her voice as calm as possible, despite the growing threat. "You don't want to go down this path. You're making a huge mistake." Harris's eyes flickered with something, irritation, maybe even doubt. But before he could respond, the radio crackled again. Then, with no further warning, he made his move. He yanked a set of handcuffs from his belt and reached for her wrist, pulling her toward him. "No more talking," he grumbled, as if in some twisted show of authority. "You're under arrest." Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes locked onto his with a clear, unwavering focus. "You're wrong," she said softly. "You can't arrest me for walking in my neighborhood. I haven't broken any law." Despite her calm demeanor, the adrenaline surged through her. As he cuffed her hands behind her back, a flash of heat surged through her body. This was not just about a wrongful arrest anymore. This was about her rights being violated, her dignity being assaulted, and the abuse of power that she had spent her entire career fighting against. "Let go of me," she commanded, her voice ice cold. She tried to take a step back, but he shoved her forward into the back of the patrol car. Harris said nothing as he pushed her into the car, securing the door with a loud click. Jasmine felt the sting of the cuffs digging into her skin, but she didn't let it show. She had seen this before. The disregard for basic rights, the dismissal of people like her, people who dared to challenge authority. But she wouldn't let him break her. As the car pulled away, Jasmine's mind raced. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. She couldn't allow herself to become just another victim of injustice. The thought of everything she had worked for, her career, her family, her mission, drove her forward. She wouldn't let this be the end of her story. Not like this. The car pulled up in front of the local precinct, and Harris got out first, not even looking at her. Jasmine remained calm, her back straight despite the humiliation. She knew this wasn't over. She had been pushed too far, and now someone was going to pay for it. The precinct was quiet as Officer Harris led Jasmine into the building. She could feel the eyes of the other officers on her as they passed by the desks and lockers. Whispers followed them, but no one dared to speak out of turn. Most of the officers, although confused, didn't question Harris's authority. They just watched in silence as Jasmine was marched past them, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Jasmine's mind was a storm of thoughts, but she focused on one thing: getting out of this situation. She had dealt with far more dangerous criminals than Harris, but it wasn't the threat of physical harm that concerned her. It was the abuse of power, the complete disregard for her rights, and the systemic injustice that had led to this moment. When they reached the holding cell area, Jasmine was roughly pushed into an empty cell. Harris stood in front of her, his expression smug, as if he had just won some small victory. He didn't say a word, but his actions spoke volumes. He was enjoying the moment, believing that he had brought down someone important. Jasmine stood in the small, cold cell, her posture straight despite the cuffs. She refused to show weakness, not now. Her thoughts were racing, but there was one question that kept coming back to her. Why had Harris been so quick to escalate the situation? Why had he chosen to target her in this way? She had no answer, but she knew one thing: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. It wasn't long before the door to the holding area opened and Sheriff Charles Harper stepped inside. The moment his eyes landed on Jasmine, his face shifted from surprise to shock. He took a moment to process the situation, but the confusion quickly turned to anger. "What the hell is going on here, Harris?" Harper demanded, his voice booming in the otherwise quiet room. Harris looked up, a hint of uncertainty flashing across his face. He had been so certain of his actions earlier, but now, facing his superior, the confidence began to crumble. "She was refusing to cooperate," Harris muttered, his tone defensive. "She was acting suspiciously in the neighborhood. I had to take her in." Harper's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to Jasmine, who still stood stoically in the corner of the cell. He took a step closer, his anger palpable. "You know who this is?" he asked, his voice low but filled with authority. Harris shrugged, clearly confused. I don't care who she is. She was causing trouble. Harper's gaze turned cold. She's Amanda Lewis, director of the FBI, he said, his words hanging in the air like a bombshell. And you've just made the biggest mistake of your career. The realization hit Harris like a freight train. His face went pale, and his eyes widened in shock. He stammered, trying to find a way to explain his actions. The FBI director? I didn't know. She didn't say anything. Jasmine stepped forward, her eyes locked on Harris. No, I didn't, because I shouldn't have to. I'm not just a title. I'm a person, and I deserve respect. You had no right to treat me this way. Harper didn't waste another second. He reached for the cuffs and unlocked them, his movements sharp and decisive. Take them off her now, he ordered, and get her out of here. Harris, still in shock, fumbled with the cuffs. He could feel the weight of his mistake crashing down on him, but he had no choice but to comply. As the cuffs were removed, Jasmine flexed her wrists, grateful to be free, but she didn't show any sign of relief. She knew that the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Harper turned to her, his voice softening. I'm sorry you had to go through this. I'll make sure this gets handled, he said, his eyes filled with genuine remorse. Jasmine nodded, her expression still stern. This wasn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been treated like this. Everyone who's had their rights violated because of their skin color, their gender, or their position in society. I won't let this go. Harper met her gaze, understanding the weight of her words. I know, and I promise you, Harris will be held accountable. He'll be investigated, and there will be consequences for what he did. Jasmine nodded again, her eyes never leaving Harris, who was now standing in the corner, looking like he had just been stripped of everything he thought he knew about power. Good, Jasmine said firmly, because this is not the world we should be living in. This is not the kind of justice we need. As Jasmine stepped out of the holding cell, she knew that what had just happened wasn't just a personal affront to her. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system, and she wasn't about to let it slide. The battle was far from over, but Jasmine, Amanda Lewis, was ready to see it through to the end. The story of what had happened that afternoon spread quickly, and soon the news reached beyond the confines of the local precinct. By the time Amanda arrived back at her home, the entire community, and much of the country, was talking about the confrontation between her and Officer Harris. The local news channels picked up the story, with some offering detailed accounts, while others focused on the shocking fact that an FBI director had been wrongfully detained by a local police officer. For Amanda, it was an overwhelming moment. She had spent most of her career working in the shadows, handling covert operations and overseeing sensitive investigations. She was used to being in the background, behind the scenes and out of the public eye. But now her name was being plastered across headlines, and it wasn't for the work she had done as a dedicated professional in the FBI. It wasn't long before the public outrage began to grow. Social media erupted with posts of support for Amanda, and many people, especially in the Black community, shared their own stories of discrimination and abuse of power. But what stood out the most were the calls for justice, not just for Amanda, but for all those who had been wronged by an officer like Harris. The incident had sparked a fire, and it was clear that this would be a moment of reckoning for the system. Within days, the investigation into Officer Harris's actions began. Evidence gathered from body cameras, witness testimonies, and even the 911 calls made during the incident all painted a damning picture of Harris's behavior. It was clear that his actions had gone far beyond reasonable suspicion. He had abused his power, made baseless accusations, and, most egregiously, escalated the situation due to racial bias. Harris had crossed a line, and the consequences were inevitable. The investigation didn't stop there. A full internal review of the precinct was ordered, and several officers who had failed to intervene were also called into question. As the truth unfolded, it became apparent that Harris wasn't the only one who had allowed prejudice to influence his actions. A pattern of racial profiling and abuse of power was starting to emerge, and Amanda knew that it was only a matter of time before the whole department would be scrutinized. A few weeks later, Officer Harris was officially fired from the police force. His reputation, once built on years of service, had been shattered in an instant. He was not only facing legal repercussions for his actions, but his career was over. Amanda stood by, watching as the investigation played out, knowing that this was only the beginning. For too long, law enforcement had turned a blind eye to the abuse of power within its own ranks. This case was a wake-up call, one that couldn't be ignored. But Amanda didn't stop there. She took this opportunity to speak out, using her platform as the FBI director to address the systemic issues within law enforcement. Her words were powerful and clear. "This is not just about one officer's mistake," she said in a public statement. "This is about the culture that allows these mistakes to happen. This is about accountability. This is about justice. And this is about ensuring that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to protect it." Her speech resonated with many across the country. Civil rights organizations, social justice advocates, and everyday citizens rallied behind her, demanding change. They called for reforms in police training, better oversight of law enforcement agencies, and a complete overhaul of the systems that allowed officers like Harris to abuse their power without fear of consequence. Amanda became a symbol of strength and resilience in the fight against racial injustice. Her courage in the face of personal humiliation had sparked a movement, and though the road ahead would be long and difficult, she was ready for the fight. She had seen the ugly face of racism and abuse of power firsthand, and now she was determined to change it, for herself, for her community, and for the generations to come. Months later, as the dust settled, Amanda stood outside the courthouse where the trial of Officer Harris had concluded. The verdict was in. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for his actions. As Amanda walked out of the courthouse, the crowds gathered around her. People cheered, waving signs of support, their faces filled with admiration for the woman who had stood up to injustice. Amanda smiled, but the weight of what had just transpired was not lost on her. This victory, while significant, was only one small step in a much larger battle. The fight against systemic racism and abuse of power was far from over. But she knew that with each victory, no matter how small, they were getting closer to the world she dreamed of. A world where justice wasn't a privilege for a few, but a right for all. She turned and looked at the crowd, her heart filled with a sense of purpose. "This is just the beginning," she thought, as the sound of cheers echoed in her ears. "We've only just begun."